witness the chilling paradox of the British Solomon. This is the story of how King James I, the visionary patron of Shakespeare and translator of the world's most famous Bible, used his genius not to uplift humanity, but to meticulously build the legal and theological framework for a nationwide witch-hunting terror. Discover how one man's personal paranoia, written into law, condemned hundreds to the gallows. What if the greatest intellectual achievement of a kingdom and its most brutal state-sanctioned horror shared the same author? Here are two signatures. One is on the King James Bible, a masterpiece of language and faith that has shaped the English-speaking world for centuries. The other is on a warrant for torture, based on a king's personal belief that old women, using demonic cats, tried to murder him at sea. How did Europe's most scholarly monarch, a poet, a theologian, a man who debated the finest minds of his age, become the kingdom's lead inquisitor, personally overseeing witch trials and authoring the official handbook for a witch hunt? This is not a tale of medieval ignorance. This is the story of what happens when enlightened reason, absolute power, and primal fear fuse into a single, devastating ideology. To understand the terror James would unleash, you must first appreciate the brilliant, brittle mind he cultivated. He was not a tyrant carved from crude medieval stone. He was a paradox, penned in meticulous humanist script. Imagine him in his library, a realm of vellum and whispered argument, far from the muddy execution grounds of his future reign. This is James VI of Scotland, the only son of the doomed, glamorous Mary, Queen of Scots, and the murdered Lord Darnley. His cradle was a fortress, his nursery a conspiracy. Before he could read, he understood that bloodline was both a crown and a target. This primal lesson that the world hid knives in smiles would become the fracture in his otherwise formidable intellect. His education was a weapon forged for survival. Under the tutelage of the severe scholar George Buchanan, the boy king was immersed in a rigorous, almost brutal curriculum of classical literature, Protestant theology, history, and languages. He didn't just learn, he absorbed. He could debate complex points of Calvinist doctrine in fluent Latin by his teens, translate French poetry, and dissect the political philosophies of Seneca and Machiavelli. He wrote his own treatises, not mere royal pronouncements, but dense academic works like The True Law of Free Monarchies, which argued for the divine right of kings with a lawyer's precision and a zealot's conviction. Here was the core of his self-image. He was not merely a ruler by accident of birth, but Rex Pacificus, the peacemaker king, a British Solomon, whose wisdom flowed from God through his scholarly diligence. His mind was his sanctuary, a labyrinth of logic and scripture where he felt supreme and safe. And within this sanctuary, he built a court of intimacy that defied the era's conventions. His emotional world was dominated by a series of intense, passionate attachments to his male favorites. The first, Esme Stuart, Seigneur d'Aubigny, a sophisticated French cousin who arrived when James was 13, was a seismic event. Esme was everything the dour Scottish lords were not: cultured, graceful, lavishly affectionate. James, starved for warmth and sophistication, was enthralled. He made Esme a duke, his closest advisor, the center of his universe. The relationship was so consuming it sparked a rebellion by Protestant lords who feared a Catholic takeover and, more viscerally, the king's undue affection. They forcibly separated the pair, executing Esme's associate and banishing the favorite himself. Another devastating lesson in love equating to vulnerability and loss. This pattern would repeat most famously later with George Villiers, the dazzling Duke of Buckingham in England. James's letters to these men are not the dry missives of statecraft. They are breathtaking in their intimacy. To Villiers, he wrote, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake. God bless you, my sweet child and wife, and grant that you may ever be a comfort to your dear dad and husband." The language is spousal, paternal, utterly devoted. This was the king's inner circle, a fragile, romanticized realm of male loyalty and beauty, a deliberate refuge from the coarse, treacherous world of factional politics and female intrigue represented by his mother's tragic history. His court became a theater of patronage for this vision. He was the great sponsor of the arts, adopting Shakespeare's company as the king's men, filling his halls with music, masks, and the most cutting-edge continental philosophy. The atmosphere he craved was one of refined discussion, aesthetic pleasure, and unwavering personal devotion. Yet pace the halls of this enlightened court, and you would sense the shadow trailing the scholar. His gait was awkward, a legacy of childhood illness. He drank heavily to soothe his nerves. He wore heavily padded doublets for fear of the assassin's dagger. He was a man who thought in grand, systematic abstractions about kingdom and theology, but whose body lived in a constant animal state of alert. His intellectual triumph was the construction of the divine right theory, the belief that kings were answerable only to God. This wasn't just political strategy, it was psychological necessity. If his authority was literally God-given, then any challenge to it, a rebellious lord, a critical preacher, a whispering courtier, was not just treason but blasphemy. It was satanic. His scholarship had built an impeccable logical fortress for his power, but from its high towers, every dissenting voice below began to resemble the murmur of hell. So we see him, on the eve of his great personal crisis, a figure of profound contradiction. Europe's most book-learned monarch, a linguist and poet, who trembled at sudden sounds. A man who yearned for peace and philosophical discourse, yet ruled with a theory of authority that brooked no question. A king who built a fragile, beautiful world of male intimacy as a buffer against a universe he perceived as fundamentally hostile. This was the complex, pressurized vessel, a mind of immense capability, steeped in fear and absolute certainty, waiting for the catalyst. The storm was not just a meteorological event. It was the one external shock capable of fusing his towering intellect and his bottomless terror into a single, catastrophic mission. The scholar was about to close his books on humanism and open a new, dreadful volume. He was about to turn the full force of his reason away from understanding the world and towards hunting the monsters he was now certain lived in it. The catalyst was not a subtle shift in policy, but a violent convulsion of nature that confirmed every hidden dread festering in the king's mind. In October of 1589, James set sail from Leith to fetch his betrothed, Princess Anne of Denmark, a political match that promised stability and Protestant alliance. The North Sea in autumn is a brooding ink-black entity, but this was different. The fleet was overtaken by a storm of legendary ferocity, a chaos of shrieking wind and mountainous waves that seemed to pursue the royal vessel with a personal, malevolent will. Ships were scattered, masts splintered, and the king, trapped in the pitching belly of his ship, faced what he believed was a certain watery death. He would later describe these tempests as contrary winds, not as acts of God, but as something more sinister, unnatural. They were, in his perception, unnavigable, unceasing, and intellectually inexplicable by mere meteorology. For a mind that prided itself on categorizing and understanding the world, this storm existed outside logical order. It felt, profoundly, like an attack. He found safe harbor in Norway, married Anne there, and wintered in Denmark. It was in this Lutheran kingdom, a hotbed of intense witch-hunting fervor, that the seeds of suspicion planted by the sea were watered into a certainty. At court, he was immersed in the latest continental theories of demonic conspiracy. Danish theologians and judges spoke not of isolated ignorant crones, but of vast, clandestine networks of Satan's servants, holding secret Sabbaths and waging war against Christian kingdoms. Here, the intellectual framework for his fear was gifted to him. When he finally returned to Scotland in the spring of 1590, he did not come home with just a queen. He carried back a settled conviction. The storm had been a magical assassination attempt. His near martyrdom was not chance, it was evidence of a hidden war. And now, as God's anointed lieutenant, it was his sacred duty to uncover the combatants. This duty took the form of a book. In 1597, he published Demonology in form of a dialogue. This is the critical turn. He did not simply order arrests. He first built an intellectual fortress, using the very scholarly tools that had once been marks of his enlightenment. The treatise is not a raving pamphlet. It is a chillingly systematic work, structured as a civilized conversation between two characters, Epistemon and Philomathes. Through them, James meticulously dismantles skepticism. With the painstaking logic of a doctoral thesis, he proves the reality of witchcraft, categorizes different types of demons, outlines the specifics of the witch's pact, signed with the witch's own blood, he notes clinically, and details their methods. He explains how witches can raise storms. They do not control the weather, but persuade the devil to do so, and the devil, commanding the legions of air, obliges. He dedicates entire sections to what are the ways possible to the devil to appear in, and how can he appear in so many forms at one time. The horror of the Daemonology lies in its reasonable tone. This is a king deploying citation, classical precedent, and Socratic dialogue to convince his readers that their elderly, impoverished neighbor might literally be sucking the life from their child or poisoning their cattle through a waxen image. He moves from abstract theology to gruesomely practical advice, describing how to find the devil's mark, an insensible spot on the body where the familiar spirit would suck, and endorsing the pricking of suspects with needles to discover it. He logically defends the use of torture in these cases, arguing that since witchcraft is a crimen exceptum, an exceptional crime of such secrecy and spiritual danger, normal legal restraints must be suspended. The scholar's mind has become the inquisitor's manual. Every fear is given a footnote. Every superstition is armored with syllogism. The storm at sea has been translated into text, and that text would soon become a warrant. With the intellectual framework laid, the scholar king stepped from his library into the interrogation chamber. The 1590-92 North Berwick witch trials were not merely a judicial proceeding. They were James's live experiment, a dark theater where the hypotheses of Demonology would be tested under the royal gaze. The initial accusations arose from fairly typical village gossip. A maid, Gillis Duncan, was suspected of healing by suspicious means. But when word reached the king of a potential conspiracy behind his storm, the investigation transformed. It was pulled from local hands and elevated to a matter of state, directly overseen by the monarch and his privy council. James did not wait for reports to be sent to Holyrood. He traveled to the coast, to the epicenter of the fear, making the hunt a royal progress into the underworld. The interrogations, conducted under his explicit direction, became a grotesque feedback loop. The suspects, beginning with Dr. John Fian, a schoolmaster accused of being the Coven's register, were subjected to the peine-forte et dure, sleep deprivation, crushing weights, and the boots, an instrument of torture that shattered bone and ligament. The goal was not merely confession, but narrative. James sought the specifics he had penned: the devil's mark, the satanic pact, the details of the Sabbath. And under agony the accused provided them. They spoke of a gathering of over 200 witches in the church at North Berwick, of dancing backward against the sun, of kissing the devil's cold, hairy buttocks. They named James himself as the target, describing how christened cats were thrown into the sea to raise the very winds that had plagued his voyage. Each extracted detail was not seen as a fabrication of pain, but as a stunning validation of the king's scholarship. His book was coming to life before him, in the broken voices of the tormented. The climax of this perverse validation came with the interrogation of Agnes Sampson, a respected midwife and healer. Initially defiant, she was broken by torture and brought before the king. To prove her confession true, she did something astonishing. She leaned close to James and, in a whisper, recounted the precise words he and Queen Anne had exchanged in their private bedchamber on their wedding night in Oslo. To James, this was not a violation of privacy, but a metaphysical shock. It was the ultimate proof. Only a servant of Satan with access to diabolical spies could know such a thing. His rational mind, which should have questioned how such information could have traveled by mundane means, was silenced by awe and terror. The event confirmed everything. The conspiracy was real, its reach was intimate, and his role as God's champion against it was ordained. Samson's whisper was the key that locked his paranoia into an unshakable reality. Under this direct royal scrutiny, the confessions spiraled into a grand, Baroque tapestry of treason. The witches, it was said, had sought to kill the king by melting a wax image, by poisoning his washcloth, by conjuring storms to drown him. They had disinterred corpses to make magical powders. James presided over this unfolding script with the intense engagement of a director and lead critic. He questioned the logic of their stories, probed for inconsistencies, and used his own theological knowledge to trip them up, making the torture chamber an extension of his scholarly debates. When a suspect's story faltered, it was not evidence of a lie coerced by agony, but proof of the devil's attempt to deceive the righteous king. His intellectual vanity became a component of the torture itself. The trials culminated in a series of public executions by fire, a spectacle of divine justice, personally endorsed by the monarch. The North Berwick episode was a transformative personal and political event. It proved to James that his theoretical demonology was a practical and essential field guide. He had not just written about witches, he had, by the power of his office and intellect, successfully uncovered and destroyed a cell of them. The experience forged him into a unique and terrifying hybrid, the Sovereign Inquisitor. He now believed he possessed a personal, hard-won expertise that surpassed that of his judges. From this point forward, witch hunting was no longer a distasteful duty of kingship. It was a sacred, personal crusade, and his authority on the subject was unimpeachable. The line between the throne and the rack had been irrevocably blurred. The true measure of a sovereign's belief is not what he writes, nor what he investigates, but what he codifies into law. The North Berwick trials were a localized, if royally sanctioned, horror. James's accession to the English throne in 1603 presented a far more terrifying prospect: the opportunity to sculpt an entire kingdom's legal and spiritual consciousness in the image of his fear. He arrived in England trailing two reputations, that of the learned British Solomon and the darker whispered lore of the Scottish witch hunter. It was the latter that would soon be etched into statute. His personal demonology was about to become England's national policy. The mechanism was the Witchcraft Act of 1604, a piece of legislation that bears the fingerprints of James's traumatic past and his chilling scholarly conclusions. It replaced the milder Elizabethan law of 1563, and its amendments were brutally specific, a direct translation of Demonology into legalese. The new act made invoking or consorting with evil spirits a capital felony, even if no harm was proven. The mere pact with the devil was enough for the gallows. Crucially, it also expanded the death penalty to include the act of exhuming bodies for magical purposes, a direct nod to the graveyard crimes confessed at North Berwick. But perhaps its most devastating clause was the one that extended the scope of the law to encompass the second hand. If one person's witchcraft caused the death of another, not only the perpetrator, but anyone who had consulted, covenanted with, entertained, employed, fed, or rewarded them, was also guilty of a felony. This created a terrifying web of guilt by association, perfectly designed to snare whole families and communities in a panic. This was not a passive law. James actively propagated its ideology. He presented a copy of his Demonology to his new Archbishop of Canterbury, a symbolic passing of the torch from theological scholar to ecclesiastical enforcer. His judges, lawyers, and local magistrates now operated under a double authority: the weight of statute law and the implicit, towering expertise of the king who had written the book on the subject, literally. To question the pervasive reality of witchcraft was not merely legal ignorance, it was to contradict the crown's most intimate, hard-won knowledge. The act provided the legal framework, while the king's fearsome personal reputation provided the zealous momentum. The court itself became a dissonant stage for this dual monarchy. On one hand, it was a beacon of Renaissance sophistication. James commissioned the soaring authorized version of the Bible, a project demanding immense scholarly collaboration. He lavished attention on his favorites, presided over intricate masks designed by Ben Jonson, with scenery by Inigo Jones, and delighted in philosophical debate. Yet, woven into the fabric of this splendor were constant reminders of the spectral enemy. Shakespeare's Macbeth, performed for the court around 1606, is the starkest artifact. It is a play that feels written to a royal brief. It opens with witches controlling winds, speaks of sailing in a sieve, and features a Scottish king, usurped by sinister forces. It is a dramatic affirmation of James's own worldview, a flattering nightmare that validated his crusade. The very art he patronized served to echo and magnify his fixations. This institutional and cultural drumbeat had a single, corrosive effect. It legitimized panic. It told every justice of the peace, every village parson, every suspicious neighbor that their darkest suspicions were not only possible, but probable, and were of the highest concern to the state. The law empowered the accuser and stripped the accused of defense. For what defense was possible against a crime witnessed in dreams, proved by phantom marks, or confessed under a torment the law itself sanctioned? The state had officially endorsed a supernatural crime, and in doing so, dismantled the very rules of evidence that protected the innocent. The king's private trauma, now enshrined in Act of Parliament, created a nation where a child's fit, a failed harvest, or a lingering illness could be transformed, with the full force of the crown behind it, into a capital charge. The hunt was no longer a personal project of the king. He had built a self-perpetuating engine, wound it tight with legal precision, and set it loose upon the land. To understand the true reach of the king's obsession, you must leave the court and travel north to the raw, mist-clung moorlands of Lancashire. Here, in 1612, the abstract principles of the 1604 Act and the theoretical horrors of Demonology found their grim, practical expression in the trials of the Pendle witches. This case stands as a perfect, awful microcosm, a blueprint of how the king's intellectual convictions, transmitted through the legal system, dismantled the lives of the utterly powerless. The records of the proceedings, published by the clerk Thomas Potts as the wonderful discovery of witches in the county of Lancaster, provide a chilling transcript of the machine at work. The spark was local, an altercation between a peddler and a beggar woman, Alison Device, on a lonely road. When the peddler suffered a stroke after her curse, a chain reaction began, fueled by ancient family rivalries and the desperate bargains of the accused to save themselves. But the timber that turned this spark into a conflagration was the legal framework James had built. The central figure, an old woman named Elizabeth Southerns, known as Old Demdike, was blind, impoverished, and steeped in local folk magic. The very archetype of the vulnerable, suspicious figure the new laws targeted. Under questioning, and likely facing the threat of torture sanctioned for witchcraft, the confessions began to flow. But these were not the grand continental conspiracies of North Berwick. They were stories of poverty, resentment, and petty disputes, now reinterpreted through the mandatory lens of diabolism. The true engine of the tragedy, however, was the specific rule James had championed: guilt by association and the incentivizing of accusation. 10-year-old Janet Device, granddaughter of Demdike, was brought before the court with the solemnity of a child who has been taught she is performing a holy duty. She pointed a finger at her own family and neighbors, detailing their meetings at Malkin Tower, their familiar spirits, their plots to blow up Lancaster Castle. Her testimony, delivered with childish certainty, was admissible and devastating. The law had weaponized a child, transforming familial bonds into vectors of death. Similarly, one of the accused, a woman named Alice Gray, was dismissed not because of her innocence, but because, as Potts notes, there was no other evidence against her but the said Janet's. The standard was not proof but accusation. The state had created a system where survival instinct demanded naming others, weaving a web of narrative from which no one could escape. The trial itself was a grotesque pantomime of justice, operating on the king's foundational premise that witchcraft was a crime in exceptum, an exceptional crime. Spectral evidence, the testimony of spirits and visions, was entertained. The devil's mark, that insensible spot James had written of, was sought on the bodies of the accused by a professional pricker. The primary evidence against many was the testimony of those already condemned, desperate to curry favor. The judge, Sir Edward Bromley, operated under the shadow of the king's known fervor, eager to demonstrate his vigilance in rooting out this spiritual treason. There was no defense counsel, no meaningful challenge to hearsay, no exploration of motive beyond the satanic. The process was not about discovering truth. It was about confirming a pre-existing narrative of a kingdom under demonic siege. In August 1612 at Lancaster Jail, 10 people were hanged on the strength of this process. They died not for raising storms against a king, but for being old, poor, quarrelsome, or simply unlucky enough to be named by someone more terrified than they were. They were the logical endpoint of an ideology that had trickled down from the throne. A theology that saw Satan's hand in misfortune, a law that made fantasy a capital offense, and a culture that sanctioned the betrayal of the weak to appease the powerful. Pendle was not orchestrated by James in person, but it was utterly his creation. It proved his system worked with a horrible bureaucratic efficiency. The intellectual fortress he had built to protect his own psyche had become a factory, consuming the obscure and the marginalized to feed the kingdom's new state-mandated appetite for witches. The terror was no longer personal to the monarch. It was institutional, impersonal, and it could now run itself. To view James solely as a monster is to miss the profound, unsettling human tragedy at the core of his reign. The same hands that signed warrants for torture also gently corrected his son's Latin translations. The mind that dissected demonic pacts with clinical fervor could weep over a poignant sonnet or debate the nuances of peace with Spain. He was not a simple fanatic. He was a man whose immense capacities for tenderness, scholarship, and governance were violently compartmentalized from his consuming terror. Understanding this fracture is key to understanding how the horror persisted. It was nurtured not by a soulless brute, but by a complex individual who believed with every fiber of his learned being that he was engaged in a cosmic war for which kindness was a separate private language. Look at his family life, or what passed for it. His relationship with his eldest son, Prince Henry, reveals a startling softness. James doted on the boy, carefully overseeing his humanist education, writing him detailed pedagogical letters full of fatherly advice on piety, statecraft, and hunting. He saw in Henry the idealized version of kingship, martial, Protestant, popular, and his guidance was affectionate, patient, and proud. When Henry died tragically young in 1612, the king was shattered, retreating into a profound grief that muted even his political energies. This was a man capable of deep familial love. Similarly, his passionate attachments to his favorites, like George Villiers, were characterized by an almost overwhelming need for emotional dependency and demonstrative affection. He created around himself a courtly culture of male intimacy that valued poetry, beauty, and loyalty. This was the sanctuary of his heart. yet step outside that charmed circle, and the rules of engagement changed utterly. The unifying principle was his absolute, unshakable self-conception as God's unique lieutenant on earth. This was not mere political theory to James. It was the bedrock of his identity, the solution to the vulnerability of his childhood. If his authority was a divine conduit, then any challenge to it was not simply political dissent. It was an act of spiritual rebellion. A rebellious noble was not just a traitor, he was an agent of satanic pride. A Catholic plot was not just ambition, it was the Antichrist's machinations. And a witch's curse was not village malice. It was a direct assault on God's chosen vessel. His intellectual framework did not allow for coincidence, misfortune, or political opposition as mundane facts. His scholarship had equipped him to see patterns, and in every shadow, he saw the same pattern: the eternal struggle between divine order and demonic chaos, with his own person as the central battleground. This is why compassion could not cross the conceptual moat he had built. The old woman accused in Pendle was not an object of pity, because she existed in a different category of being. She was, by confession or association, a conscious soldier in the army against which he was God's general. Interrogating her under torture was not cruelty. It was tactical intelligence gathering in a spiritual war. Signing her death warrant was not murder. It was a necessary execution to protect the spiritual integrity of the realm. His humanity was reserved for those within the fold: his family, his favorites, his faithful subjects. Those accused of witchcraft had, in his theological reality, voluntarily placed themselves outside the fold of humanity by their pact with the devil. He could pen a tender letter to Steenie, Villiers, and hours later approve the hanging of a dozen witches with the same serene conviction of righteousness. The most chilling aspect is that this wasn't hypocrisy. It was sincerity. His mind was a cathedral of compartmentalized logic. In one chapel, he worshiped the God of love and scholarship, of beautiful boys and eloquent prayers. In another darker chapel, he knelt before the God of vengeance and judgment, a deity whose enemies required ruthless physical eradication. He saw no contradiction because his core belief, his divine appointment, demanded both expressions of stewardship. To love his son was to nurture God's future viceroy. To burn the witch was to protect God's current one. The tragedy is that his immense learning, which might have fostered skepticism, was instead deployed to fortify this bifurcated reality. He used his knowledge of Scripture to justify the persecution, his understanding of law to enable it, and his love of debate to rhetorically destroy any who questioned it. The contradiction did not tear him apart. It was the engine of his reign: the scholar king, the loving father, the paranoid inquisitor. They were all facets of the same jewel, each reflecting a different, terrifying light. He walked through his own court, a living paradox, dispensing patronage and terror with equal certainty, forever the lonely monarch at the center of a universe he believed was watching and plotting, its every move directed personally at him. James the Divine died at his favorite country estate, Theobald's, in March 1625, succumbing to a combination of dysentery and kidney failure. His passing was not dramatic. It was the slow, painful ebbing of a body long abused by rich food and constant anxiety. He was buried with full monarchical pomp in Westminster Abbey, his tomb in the Henry VI Chapel, eventually sharing space with the son who outshone him, Charles I. The official legacy began its work immediately. Eulogists praised the British Solomon, the peacemaker who united crowns, the scholar king who gave Christendom its definitive Bible. This was the story meant for the marble and the history books, a narrative of intellectual and political achievement. Yet, in the dusty attics of country manor houses, in the procedural manuals of provincial judges, and most damningly, in the unbroken chain of legal precedent, another legacy pulsed with a more vigorous and terrible life. For the machinery he built did not rust upon his death. The Witchcraft Act of 1604 remained the law of the land. The cultural mindset he validated, that Satan's minions walked the earth in human form, that spectral evidence had a place in court, that torturous interrogation could unveil a supernatural crime, had been baked into the foundations of English and Scottish justice. His personal crusade had professionalized witch hunting. It had created a class of experts, from prickers to pamphleteers, who had a vested interest in continuing the work. Most importantly, it had provided a terrifyingly simple and emotionally satisfying answer to human suffering. It was malice, deliberate, and supernatural. This explanatory power outlived the king by generations. The most grotesque flowering of James's legacy came 2 decades after his death, during the English Civil War, in the form of Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled Witch Finder General. Hopkins operated in the 1640s, a period of social and religious upheaval that mirrored and magnified the paranoid climate James had cultivated. Hopkins did not need royal patronage. He had the blueprint. His methods were a grim, popularized echo of the North Berwick inquiries, prolonged swimming tests, forced sleeplessness, the meticulous searching for the devil's mark. His explosive career, which may have claimed over 200 lives, was enabled by a legal and intellectual environment James had fundamentally shaped. The pamphlets Hopkins and his associates published to justify their work were the direct, vulgar descendants of Demonology, trading the king's scholarly dialogue for lurid, sensationalist prose aimed at a mass audience. The king's academic fear had successfully trickled down into a profitable populist terror. Yet, in a final, stark paradox, the very intellectualism James championed also planted the seeds for the dismantling of his darkest project. The later 17th century saw the rise of a new kind of scholarly skepticism. Men like Reginald Scott, whose The Discovery of Witchcraft James had famously condemned and ordered burned, began to find a wider audience. Influential voices, including the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, began to question the very possibility of witchcraft as a physical crime, arguing against the admission of incorporeal evidence into corporeal courts. The Royal Society, founded in 1660 under the patronage of James's grandson, Charles II, championed a framework of natural philosophy and empirical evidence that gradually made the witch trials' reliance on dreams and specters seem embarrassingly primitive. The last judicial executions for witchcraft in England occurred in 1682, and the law itself was finally repealed in 1736. The edifice fell, brick by brick, under the weight of the same Enlightenment values James had in other realms so adored. So we are left with 2 indelible, conflicting marks on history. One is ethereal, a masterpiece of language, the soaring, resonant prose of the King James Bible, a text whose phrases seeped into the very bone of English thought. The other is a stain in the earth, a collective memory of village fear and the gibbet's shadow. The profound tragedy is that they originated from the same source. James proved that a mind capable of the highest cultural achievement could simultaneously sanction the most barbaric injustice, not through ignorance, but through a fervent, reasoned conviction. His reign stands as an eternal caution that the tools of scholarship, logic, rhetoric, systematic thought are not inherently moral. They can just as easily build a cathedral of faith as a fortress for fear. And when that fortress becomes a state's policy, the moat is filled, not with water, but with the blood of the powerless. His legacy is the haunting question of which is more enduring: the beauty we create or the terror we justify. The final, unsettling truth of James Stewart's story is not found in a courtroom or a royal decree, but in the quiet space where ideology is born. We have traveled from a storm-tossed ship to the scaffold's drop, following the chain of causation from one man's fear to a nation's trauma. But to conclude, we must step back and examine the blueprint of the catastrophe itself. This is not merely a history of witchcraft, it is a forensic study of how an idea metastasizes. James's reign demonstrates with terrible clarity that the most dangerous idea is not a simple shout of hate. It is a complex, self-justifying system, elegantly constructed by a brilliant mind to explain its own suffering and to project that suffering onto the world. Consider the architecture of this idea. It was not monolithic, but layered, each stratum reinforcing the next. At its base was a personal trauma, the visceral, life-threatening terror of the North Sea storm. Upon this, he built a scholarly framework, Demonology, using logic and theology to transmute raw fear into intellectual certainty. This was then encased in legal armor, the 1604 Act, granting the force of the state to his personal convictions. Finally, it was adorned with cultural legitimacy, court masks, approved pamphlets, the tacit approval of the church. The result was a self-sustaining intellectual organism, resistant to doubt because it could explain doubt itself as diabolical deception. An opponent wasn't just wrong, they were either foolishly ignorant of the evidence or willfully in league with the enemy. The system had no exit doors. This is what separates James's witch hunt from the sporadic, local panics that preceded him. He did not just react to superstition, he bureaucratized it. He provided a standardized, royal-approved checklist for identifying the enemy, the devil's mark, the familiar spirit, the satanic pact. He transformed a folk crime into a treason of the spiritual state. In doing so, he offered a powerful, corrupting temptation to every level of society. For the ambitious magistrate, zeal in witch hunting was a path to royal favor. For the resentful neighbor, it was a legal weapon. For the theologian, it was proof of a living active devil. The idea proliferated because it was useful, because it served earthly ambitions and answered existential anxieties, all under the cloak of divine sanction. And herein lies the chilling, enduring resonance. James's story is a pristine case study in the anatomy of ideological extremism. The specific villain, the witch, is almost incidental. The mechanism is what matters. The absolute conviction that one's own perspective is not merely opinion, but revealed truth. That dissent is not difference, but malice, and that the world is divided into agents of light and shadows of a vast, hidden conspiracy. His intellect, which should have been a tool for nuance and inquiry, became a fortress against them. He used his education not to question, but to defend, not to explore, but to categorize and condemn. This is the tragedy of the scholar king. He revered the tools of the mind, but abandoned its essential spirit, skepticism. When we look at the two portraits of his reign, the luminous Bible and the bloody witchpricker's needle, we are not looking at a hypocrite. We are looking at a true believer. And that is a far more terrifying prospect. Hypocrisy is a moral failing that contains its own critique. Sincere belief, armed with power, resources, and a sophisticated ideology, is an historical force. It builds systems, it writes laws, it convinces ordinary people that cruelty is duty, that persecution is protection, that turning on their neighbors is a sacred act. James's ultimate legacy, then, is a warning about the neutrality of intellect. Reason is an engine, and morality must choose its destination. A mind capable of orchestrating the poetic harmony of the 23rd Psalm was equally capable of designing the legal torture of a beggar woman, suspected of keeping a demonic cat. The same faculties of pattern recognition that can translate ancient languages can also see satanic plots and coincidence. The passion for order that seeks to compile a perfect Bible can also demand the systematic purging of imagined subversives. He teaches us that enlightenment is not a guarantee of humanity, that a library is no vaccination against barbarity, that the most profound dangers can emerge not from the dark ages of ignorance, but from the well-lit studies of the highly educated, the deeply read, the passionately convinced. His story ends not with a verdict of good king or bad, but with a sobering reflection. The tools we use to build our heavens are always and forever the same tools with which we construct our hells. The most dangerous idea is the one that convinces us we are fighting monsters, while we quietly become the architects of the very terror we fear. And so, we are left at the foot of two monuments. One is carved from language, its verses echoing in countless churches and quiet moments of solace, a testament to a king's desire for unity and divine favor. The other is built from absence, from the silenced voices of the hundreds, men but overwhelmingly women, who met their end at the gallows or the stake, their stories often reduced to a line in a paranoid clerk's ledger. The space between these monuments is the true map of James VI and I's soul, a landscape where towering intellect and abyssal fear shared a single throne. This investigation reveals a verdict more unsettling than simple villainy. We did not find a raving madman, but a logical fanatic. Not an uneducated brute, but a scholar who weaponized his own erudition. His profound tragedy and the source of his historical danger was his utter sincerity. He genuinely believed the spectral evidence, trusted the confessions wrung from agony, and saw himself as the beleaguered champion of a god under demonic siege. In his mind, every warrant he endorsed was an act of defense, every execution a tragic but necessary victory in a cosmic war. This unshakable conviction is what allowed the horror to be perpetrated, not with a snarl, but with a sigh of regretful duty. It is what made the system he built so efficient, so contagious, and so durable. The lesson here cuts far deeper than the 17th century. James's story is a masterclass in the corruption of reason, a case study in how the very tools we use to illuminate the world, logic, scholarship, a desire for order, can, when fused with personal trauma and absolute power, be used to darken it. It demonstrates that the most effective persecutors are not those who reject knowledge, but those who bend it to serve their deepest anxieties. They don't burn books. They write their own, and then use them as manuals for oppression. In the end, the haunting question James I bequeaths to us is not about witchcraft, but about certainty. How do we guard against our own reasoned certainties? How do we prevent our personal storms from becoming other people's trials? His legacy is a perpetual, sobering reminder that the line between a crusade and a crime is often visible only in retrospect, and that the most beautiful ideas can become, in the grip of unquestioned fear, instruments of profound cruelty. The true demonology we must forever study is not the catalog of imagined spirits, but the human capacity to build perfect, rational hells for one another, all while believing to the very depths of our educated souls that we are building heaven.